From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The race for New York governor becomes unexpectedly competitive as Republicans regain momentum heading into the November midterm elections. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. New York Governor Kathy Hochul is running for her first full term after inheriting the governor's mansion last year from Andrew Cuomo. And until about a week or two ago, the polls showed Hochul up by 10 points or a little bit more over her Republican challenger, Congressman Lee Zeldin. But Governor Hochul now must be looking over her shoulder. The Real Clear Politics average has tightened to 6.2 points. And there's a Quinnipiac poll out Tuesday that shows Zeldin down by only 4 with a margin of error of 2.4 points. And so, Kim, with 3 weeks to go here, is it no longer inconceivable to imagine a Republican governor of New York next year?
Not at all. And I would point out that while it has been a very dismal time in New York in terms of leadership in the past decade in particular, this is not an unusual thing. We have had moments in history where, even though New York is a very democratic state and has been for a long time, that the population simply gets fed up with problems that come from unremitting liberal governance, and then they decide to put in a Republican governor. So you can go back to 1994, where George Pataki won and, in fact, had quite a long run in the state. He was there until 2006 as governor. We've also seen this happen in New York City. Rudy Giuliani, who did amazing work in terms of cutting back on crime, also welfare reform. Michael Bloomberg, who carried on from that first as a Republican, then as an independent. And you're also, you see it in other states as well, too. Massachusetts, it's a good example. We'll see what happens here. But one thing I would point out is just in last year's election in New Jersey, Phil Murphy, who's the Democratic governor, came within just a little more than 2 points of almost losing his reelection to a Republican, Jack Ciattarelli. It was a bit of a surprise, but it showed that there is a sentiment out there among voters who are getting very sick, in particular, of rising crime rates, of inflation, of poor management, and progressive policies. And so I don't think this is outside the realm of possibility at all.
There is a trend of blue states electing Republican governors or mayors as a check on one-party power. And as Kim recounts, it's been a while since New York State did that. But other states have, and fascinatingly, these tend to be the most popular governors in the country. And I will point to a Morning Consult poll from April. And the top 3 most popular governors in the whole nation are Charlie Baker, the Republican in Massachusetts, 74% approval, Phil Scott, the Republican in Vermont, 72% approval, and Larry Hogan, the Republican in Maryland, 71% approval. And so, Monet, I think this is a fascinating phenomenon. Running as a Republican in one of these states, no doubt must be daunting. But when you get in office, voters tend to like you. And I can only theorize that they enjoy having a bit of a pause on the culture war. And meanwhile, nobody's taxes go up.
Exactly. As you point out, it's sort of a long-standing trend that some of these states that reliably vote blue in federal elections do swing to Republican candidates for the governorship. And that happens particularly, as Kim was mentioning, when there are either big problems with the cost of living, like the rise of inflation we've seen over the past couple of years, or big problems with crime. And it's not that hard to see why these types of Republican governors tend to be very popular. They are focused on these kinds of kitchen table issues that at the end of the day are dominating the day-to-day consciousness of the voters. And so if they think that there's someone reasonable in office who's basically trying to make sure that the basics of their lives are improving, they're going to respond to that even if they might disagree with them about other culture war issues. But I also think it's interesting to note that all 3 of the governors you just mentioned, Baker in Massachusetts, Scott in Vermont, and Hogan in Maryland, all have business backgrounds. They all had sort of successful careers in the private sector before entering politics. And I think they come into office with that approach in mind. Basically, I want to make state government work again. I'm not going to lean into these national issues, particularly the more controversial cultural issues. And people do really value that, especially in a state and local leader. So I do think that that provides a model, even for someone like Zeldin, who is in government, to follow. Just focused on the practical issues. That's what he's done, particularly crime. And I think that's the biggest reason why he's coming very close to contesting.
One of the arguments that Governor Hochul is making is that we can't trust Lee Zeldin in office. He has voted for anti-abortion bills. She has an ad featuring an OBGYN who says that she is terrified Lee Zeldin could become governor. But one interesting point there is that Lee Zeldin's response is basically, I would be one guy in Albany, and there's no way that I could change abortion law by myself, and I won't do it. And if you look at the majorities Democrats hold in the state assembly, that's 107 Democrats to 42 Republicans. And in the Senate, it's 42 Democrats to 20 Republicans. It seems there's no way that New York abortion law is changing anytime soon. And to the point that Monet raises, the issues that voters seem to care about most, that's the other thing I take away from this Quinnipiac poll, is among likely voters, the top issue, 28% of them say is crime. And the number two issue, 20% of them say is inflation. And so let's start with crime. There has been this sense of criminal impunity in New York, I guess. And if you search for New York Post stories about unprovoked attacks on pedestrians on the subway, there are plenty of them that come up. Here's one from October 16th. Just a few days ago, a 26-year-old man standing on a subway platform at 11:50 a.m., so just before noon, was suddenly pushed by a stranger onto the tracks. The man did not make any contact with the third rail and was helped back up to the platform by a Good Samaritan. Before any trains arrived, the suspect fled in an unknown direction. And Kim, I think there are people who take the subway to work are pretty alarmed by this, and they don't see the current political leadership responding to it in a way that they think is going to solve the problem.
There's a couple of problems here, too, and Democrats don't have much that they can run on because, first of all, New York was one of the state cities that was very much at the center of the defund the police movement. So we've had a lot of discussion about how police there are demoralized. Governor Bill de Blasio definitely cut back and stepped on the tools that they could use to go out and fight crime. Many of them live in fear now of being disciplined if they overstep some sort of line that offends progressives who are in office. And, we've seen this happening to cops across the country. And so this has certainly been a problem in the NYPD. And so there's that, and that has certainly allowed crime to escalate. But the other problem has been, and this has very much been cheered by progressives and the state and local leadership of Democrats, is the state's bail reform, as it were, along with all of these progressive prosecutors like Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who have made it so that people who are arrested are almost immediately put back out on the street. And there is therefore a sense of criminal impunity, as it were, in the city, where people feel they can just go along and do these things and engage in such crime, and that there really will be no consequences. And for a while, people began to understand how the defund the police movement was beginning to hurt cities. But I would say that over the last year, the point about this cashless bail and also these progressive prosecutors has really sunk in as well, too. And the combination of it reflects very poorly on the Democrats that are in charge. And that's what voters are really rebelling against.
And some of that, I think, is what is propelling Zeldin's candidacy here. He says he's going to repeal cashless bail. He also says that the governor has the power and indeed the duty to remove district attorneys if they refuse to enforce the criminal laws that have been duly passed by the state legislature. And the other issue, I think the second one, inflation, also works to his advantage. And to the extent that that's a proxy for more general economic anxieties, Lee Zeldin is talking about tax cuts and making New York more competitive again. And Monet, he's also talking about fracking, allowing more natural gas extraction, particularly in, the southern tier area of New York, which is, areas of New York that are struggling, that are outside of Manhattan, which is what a lot of people think of. There's a lot of New York that's not Manhattan, and it's having economic issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I do think that there is a kind of short-term focus on inflation, and that's nationwide. People are seeing more and more of their income swallowed up by prices, groceries, gas, and things like that, and wage gains have not kept up with that. So that is something that is really on the minds of voters in the short term, but I think Zeldin wisely understands that New York State, like a lot of blue states, frankly, does have these long-term, more structural economic problems, and that the role of the governor is in part to try to put the state on better footing. So you mentioned one being taxation. Obviously, New York's corporate and individual taxes are quite high relative to the national average, and that has led to a slowdown in the number of businesses forming and just increase in the number of people who have decamped. I think that accelerated during the pandemic. You saw more and more New Yorkers both leaving New York City, but also even the upstate regions for states that have a much lower cost of living. And so if he's able to reform taxes, I don't know if he's laid out a specific plan for what he'd do. He wants to, potentially build consensus. But if that's something he's going to pursue, that's something I expect to resonate with a lot of New York voters. And then the fracking, that's huge. I mean, Andrew Cuomo basically ran as sort of a moderate, at least open to business, somewhat friendly, but over the course of his governorship became much more aligned with the progressive side of the Democratic Party, probably also because he wanted to have a potential platform to run for president. And so he pursued this fracking ban in a way that limited what could have been a huge industry for the state. They have a lot of sort of natural gas reserves in the southern and western part of the state. And if Zeldin is able to prioritize sort of enabling more fracking to take place in the state, that's something that could provide a lot of jobs for sort of middle skill workers in the parts of the state where there's been very little opportunity. So I do think that's something that is going to resonate with a lot of voters who have gotten used to a very sluggish economy in New York over the past few years.